Alright, so we're going to be doing trigonometric functions of real numbers again. This is day 2. Let's get right into the objectives. You will understand the trigonometric identities. There's 2 types. You will be able to write one trig function in terms of another, and you will be able to find all the trigonometric functions from the value of 1. Alright, so let's start with the fundamental trig identities. Okay, these are our identities. These identities are functions related to each other through equations. So the reciprocal identities, for example, we've got these. Okay, the cosecant is basically 1 over sine. Secant, 1 over cosine. Cotangent, 1 over tangent. Tangent we also know is sine over cosine. We also know that if this is tangent, then cotangent could also be thought of as cosine over sine. Remember, we can think of all of these as coordinates as well. So your x would be your cosine, your y would be your sine. So this could be like 1 over y, 1 over x. That one's kind of its own thing. Y over x and x over y. So that's one way to think of those. Very useful because when we need to rewrite these and kind of figure out based on information we have, just make sure you know these, and especially make sure you know these. These are a little bit trickier. Okay, so you'll notice that like the first one has sine and cosine in it, the second one has tangent and secant, and then finally cotangent and cosecant. So the trick is to try and remember which ones go with what and remember the order, because if you notice, it's not like here you have sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. Easy enough to remember, but then you have tangent squared plus 1 equals secant squared. Then you have 1 plus cotangent squared equals cosecant squared. So it gets a little confusing, but at least there's only 3 you have to memorize. So there's that. So let's start off with how those are useful. So this is kind of like a conceptual learning thing here. Like this isn't the type of question you're going to be asked about, but you're going to need to do this type of thing in order to answer questions. So let's take it step by step. So we need to express the tangent of t in terms of the cosine of t. So first, we want to rewrite the tangent of t as sine of t over cosine of t. Because we can do that because we're talking about tangent, right? Okay, next we need to rewrite because the sine of t in terms of cosine of t. So to do this, we need to go to the Pythagorean trig identity that states this. And we're doing this because we've got one cosine, so we're good there, but we need to, this is bad. We can't have that. No good. So we need to get rid of that. So we refer to our trig identity where it says sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And we say, well, I need sine squared to equal something that's not sine. So let's go ahead and subtract cosine squared from both sides. So we get sine squared equals 1 minus cosine squared. And we need to get rid of that squared, so we're going to square root both sides, which gives us that. So now that we know that the sine of the number t equals this, we can take that and plug it in. Remember, we had this back in that one step. So we can plug that in there because they're the same thing, which would give us this answer. Okay, easy enough concept. Okay, so we'll go through, and now let's say that you want to find, you've got one trig value, like you're given that the cosine of t is this, and you want to find all the other trig values. Basically, you would use all the identities or parts of the identities to help you with that. So as long as you know one of them, you can determine the value of the remaining trig values. The one additional piece of information you need is that you would need to know, so you have to know this, either the quadrant or the restrictions on t. So for example, I might say t is between 0 and pi. So that would help you narrow down what t is. Okay, so in order to find the other values, first you need to use the Pythagorean identity that corresponds to the value that you do know. So in the next example, you'll get an idea of what I mean by that. And from there, you'll have 2 of the trig identities solved, which will allow you to solve the remaining 4. Alright, so let's say we're given the sine of t equals 4 over 5, and t is in quadrant 2. And we need to find all the values of the trig functions at t. So first things first. we take the trig identity that we know, the Pythagorean identity is sine squared, and I'll just use x, whatever. We take this and we say, okay, well, we know what this is, so I'm just going to take this and plug it in. And then square it and subtract it from both sides. 4 over 5 squared is 16 over 25. Subtract that from both sides. So I have the cosine squared equals 1 minus 16 over 25, which that equals 9 over 25. I need to square root both sides. So I get the cosine of t equals plus or minus, this is important, 3 over 5. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that second bit of information that I got, that this is in quadrant 2. Okay, the cosine in quadrant 2 is negative. So we know that the cosine has to be that, because we're in quadrant 2. So now that I know my sine and my cosine, so remember we were given our sine and our cosine, I can find the rest of it. Its tangent is sine over cosine, which is negative 3 over 5, over 4 over 5, which reduces to negative 3/4. We have cosecant, which is just 1 over the sine. So if sine is 4/5, 1 over that is 5/4. Secant, which goes with this, the reciprocal identity of cosine, we can just, again, flip it, negative 5/3. And then tangent and cotangent, you're going to do the exact same thing. You're just going to flip it. Okay, so negative 3/4 is the tangent, negative 4/3 is the cotangent. So that's part of how you're going to use it. We are going to take it one step further for the quizzes and assessments, but I want to make sure that you get this. We'll practice the other stuff in class, and you will be golden. So hopefully you took good notes. Come in with questions if some of this confused you. I understand that this is a lot to take in all at once in a short amount of time, but I want to make sure that you guys get this, so come in with your questions. All right, you all have a good one.